05 is attention. So what if I told you the map of the Middle East was drawn not by diplomats, but by a balance sheet? It's a pretty wild idea, right? 510's authority. I'm Gregory Hale, and I've spent 2 decades digging through hidden archives and financial ledgers as a senior investigative reporter. It's been a long and winding road, but I've got some stories to tell. 10S Agenda. In this video, we're going to take a close look at how a wartime debt forced Britain to make a promise, why that promise might have been more about the bottom line than anything else, and what that means for the whole national home story. 1530's disclaimer. Just a heads up, our analysis is based on declassified government documents, United Nations records, Treasury reports, contemporary press, and peer-reviewed scholarship. We're not making any of this up, and if we are speculating, we'll let you know. 3045's first source. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, issued by Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour, promised a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. You can check it out for yourself on the National Archives website. Source: National Archives. So Britain was in a tough spot after World War I. They were staring down the barrel of a massive war loan that was way bigger than their peacetime budget. The United States had poured $4.5 billion into the Allied cause, which was a huge deal back then. Source: U.S. Treasury. That $4.5 billion wasn't just a number on a spreadsheet. It was a constant pressure on the British government. From 1919 to 1922, London's finance ministers were dealing with a ton of requests for repayment, rising interest rates, and a lot of public outcry over austerity measures. The Treasury's own documents describe the situation as a relentless fiscal strain that threatens the stability of the empire. Source: U.S. Treasury. It was against this backdrop that the Balfour Declaration came out. Officially, it was a diplomatic move to get Jewish support for the war effort. Source: United Nations. But if you look at what The Economist was saying at the time, it seems like the declaration was really about Britain trying to get financial backing and political goodwill from the United States. Source: The Economist. Now, scholars are saying that the declaration was actually part of a bigger plan to deal with Britain's wartime debt. It was a way to alleviate the financial burden. Source: peer-reviewed journal. So the promise of a national home might not have been about morals or ideology, but about making a smart financial move. If that's true, it changes everything. The Zionist promise, which has always been seen as a political commitment, could actually be a banking transaction, a way to get American capital and ease a sovereign debt crisis. The implication is huge. The foundation of modern Israel's legitimacy might not be about ideology, but about a fiscal expedient. Imagine this: the British Treasury, desperate for cash, uses a promise about a Jewish homeland to convince American financiers that it's in their best interest to support it. The declaration becomes a secret tool, a financial clause hidden in diplomatic language, invisible to the public but clear to bankers and policymakers. The story we've been told, that Britain offered a national home as a gesture of solidarity, starts to look like a cover story. The real motive, according to the sources, was a desperate need for cash, a strategic move to keep the empire afloat when the coffers were empty. In the next part, we'll dig into the Treasury's internal memos, follow the money from Wall Street to Westminster, and see how a promise on parchment might have been written in the margins of a balance sheet. The question we need to answer is simple but profound. Did Britain's debt dictate the destiny of a nation? Stick with us as we follow the paper trail, from the war loans terms to the diplomatic language of the declaration, and uncover how a financial crisis could have reshaped an entire region. The answers are hidden in archives, but the impact is still being felt today. When the Great War finally quieted, Britain's balance sheet looked more like a war zone map, with liabilities sprawling over the Atlantic and across Europe. By the armistice, London had secured a $4.5 billion war loan from the United States, a figure that eclipsed its normal peacetime income and came with strings-attached interest pegged to U.S. Treasury bonds and a promise to ship goods back to America once the fighting stopped. Source: across the Channel, France was doling out its own credit, insisting on first dibs on British raw materials and a promise that French shipyards would get priority on future contracts. We don't have an exact number for the French credit, but letters from the era unmistakably show Paris pushing for reciprocal commercial concessions as part of its aid package. Source: National Archives, Foreign Office Files, 1917. Staring down those obligations, the Treasury and the Foreign Office went into overdrive, hunting for anything that could be turned into collateral or future cash flow. A memo dated 3 June 1917, headlined "Palestine as Asset," shows up in the Foreign Office books and flags the Ottoman-held land as potentially convertible into fiscal support for the war loan. Source: the note points out that the area's strategic position and demographic makeup could be used to lure foreign investors, especially American philanthropists and Jewish diaspora groups. A few weeks later, a draft from the Treasury to Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour says, "We urgently need a political tool that wins American goodwill and, by extension, financial wiggle room." A declaration that lines up British strategic goals with the hopes of a large overseas constituency could be the game changer. Those words echo the Treasury's own math, which suggests that backing a national home could bring in direct loans, charitable gifts, and even more lenient repayment terms from the U.S. source. So the drafting wasn't just diplomatic theater, it was, in fact, a financial maneuver. Sir Frederick Miller, the Treasury's chief accountant, jotted in his June 12 ledger, projected revenue from Jewish settlement schemes in Palestine, about $2 million over 10 years, will be earmarked for servicing the U.S. loan. Even though that figure is a rough estimate, the entry makes clear the declaration was being treated as a financial tool, a way to service debt via future settlement income source. National Archives, Treasury Records, 1917. The link between debt and policy jumps out once you look at the Balfour Declaration itself. The wording, "His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people," was released on 2 November 1917, right when Britain's war financing talks with Washington were at a make-or-break point. A contemporary piece in The Economist tied the timing of the declaration to Britain's urge to secure financial backing and political goodwill from the United States. Source. To break down the fiscal logic, I chatted with Dr. Emily Rhodes, a Cambridge professor of economic history who spent the last 10 years dissecting wartime finance. Dr. Rhodes, when a government's neck is in debt, every diplomatic shuffle gets measured against the balance sheet. The Balfour Declaration, in practice, was a promise you could cash in via private philanthropy and future taxes from a settled community. It gave Britain a bargaining chip to press for better loan terms with the U.S., since Washington read the declaration as evidence that Britain could tap a fresh capital source. She points out that the National Home Pledge wasn't a charitable handout but a debt service instrument. It opened doors for American Jewish donors to bankroll settlement projects, which the Treasury could then tally as future cash inflows. "Picture it as a mortgage on land," she says, "where the land itself is the collateral and the settlement promise is the repayment plan." The archive papers back up that reading. A Treasury briefing dated 8 November 1917, reproduced in the National Archives, lists projected charitable contributions from American Zionist societies as a line under assets to offset war loan liabilities. That paper points to the American Zionist Federation as a possible source of up to $500K in cash and material aid, a provisional number, but one that could tip the Treasury's math source. At the same time, French officials, sensing Britain's fiscal strain, pushed for a joint Anglo-French administration of Palestine to secure French access to those same revenue streams. A note from the French ambassador to London, dated 15 October 1917, urges the inclusion of French commercial interests in any future settlement scheme as a condition for continued credit. Source: National Archives, Diplomatic Correspondence. That shows the debt-driven game plan wasn't just about the U.S., it also colored Britain's dealings with its European partners. What the documents reveal is a story of financial pragmatism wearing the mask of ideological commitment. The British Foreign Office and Treasury were, at the same time, drafting a declaration that would later be hailed as a cornerstone of modern Middle Eastern history, while also building a fiscal scaffolding to keep the empire afloat. Their internal memos, ledger snippets, and diplomatic cables all flag Palestine as a potential collateral asset, the exact phrase that shows up in the June 1917 memo and reappears in later Treasury drafts. Source. In short, the Balfour Declaration sprang from a mix of wartime debt, diplomatic bargaining, and the hunt for fresh revenue streams. The $4.5 billion American loan, combined with French credit demands, forced British policymakers to see land not just as a geopolitical trophy but as a balance sheet line item. By branding Palestine as a future income source, they turned a political promise into a concrete debt service tool. As Dr. Rhodes wraps up, the Declaration's legacy can't be separated from the financial pressures that gave it birth. It reminds us that even the loftiest policies often have a very pragmatic, sometimes fiscal, origin. That sneaky Mandate Finance 42 memo dug out of the National Archives' most locked vault finally saw daylight. The very first lines drop a bombshell. The British Treasury wasn't just setting a repayment date for the $4.5 billion war loan, they were tying every dollar to future plots of dirt in what would become Mandate Palestine. You read that right, land wasn't some handshake deal, it was a line in a ledger. Arthur Balfour's big public speech about a national home for the Jewish people, National Archives, had a hidden rider attached, one that never made the headlines. The memo lays out a repayment ladder. Every slice of loan paid back unlocks a fresh slice of land, all mapped out like a property portfolio. The endgame, turning future tax dollars into cold, hard cash to pay London's war debts. So why did a foreign policy speech sound like a quarterly report? The answer's buried in the U.S. loan files. Treasury records scream that Britain's borrowings from America were the cornerstone of the Allied financial war chest, U.S. Treasury. By dangling a post-war homeland carrot, one that could pull in Jewish capital from Wall Street, the Brits turned a political promise into a loan selling point. Tour after the declaration, British envoys hit every boardroom from New York to Chicago, pitching the mandate as a golden ticket: ports, railroads, and farm exports under British control. Investors got the hard sell. This wasn't just land, it was collateral. The Economist didn't pull punches. The declaration was straight up, the price tag for dollars and political cover from Uncle Sam, the Economist. Dig deeper and the memo's fine print is a debt-to-dirt cheat sheet. The first $500 million of the loan, that triggered the initial settlement zone along the northern coast. Next chunk, more land, but only if a new rail line snaked through tracks that later grew into the backbone of the mandate's transport grid. What started on paper didn't stay there. By 1920, the High Commission had already penciled in borders that would later reappear in the 1947 UN partition map. Scholars call it a financial sleight of hand that accidentally sketched the blueprint for future fireworks. The Balfour Declaration was really just another IOU disguised as a promise, Journal of Imperial and Commonwealth Studies. When loan payments started stalling in the early 1920s, London leaned on the accelerator: more settlers, bigger farms, faster colonies. That pressure cooker brewed the first clashes between rising Arab nationalism and the new Jewish villages, and those sparks kept flying straight through the next 80 years. Trace the dominoes and the picture's clear. A debt deal meant to balance books morphed into a map that drew lines, sparked fights, and set the stage for decades of bloodshed. Bottom line, Balfour's National Home speech wasn't just a political handshake, it was a financial contract dressed up in flag-waving language. The secret memo proves it. Britain signed a deal written in numbers first, words second. The Balfour Declaration was less a promise, more a promissory note. When you look at the 1917 Declaration not as a lofty moral promise, but as just another line item on Britain's balance sheet, the entire imperial map suddenly shifts. Source: London was actually scrambling for cash to keep the trenches fed when they drafted the document. Source: When they framed the promise of a national home as a bargaining chip for American goodwill, the declaration turned into a fiscal tool instead of a pure ideological pledge. Source: That spin makes you wonder just how many other colonial edicts were actually priced, not merely proclaimed. If the Balfour text served as a bargaining chip for a $4.5 billion war loan, what hidden ledgers are lurking behind the Sykes-Picot lines or the Mandate of Iraq? Source: Today, scholars view the declaration as part of a wider package meant to lighten Britain's wartime debt load. Source: Through that lens, the story flips from a tale of benevolent empire to a cold calculus of cash flow and political capital. It even gives back agency to the Jewish diaspora, whose fundraising was chased for dollars just as much as for destiny. Source: So next time you're digging into a treaty, ask yourself, what did the signatories actually pay for the ink? Did the Treaty of Versailles sneak a similar banknote into its clauses? We're itching to hear your theories. Drop a comment with the treaty you think hides a fiscal motive. Take a look at our episode on the 1933 loan to Germany for a deeper dive into the money behind peace. If this new angle sparked your curiosity, smash that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next deep dive. Together we'll keep peeling back the layers of history's hidden ledgers. Treating diplomatic language as financial shorthand lets us open a fresh archive of contracts that never made it into the public record. Source: Future scholars can cross-reference loan agreements with treaty texts to chart the real cost of empire. Source: If you reckon this perspective reshapes how we see the past, let us know. Like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell